computer. Okay, this evening we have Bruce Knotts, the former, I don't know if I have the title, director of the UU office at the UNO. Is that correct, or do you have a more officious?
That is correct, and I am currently the director of international engagement at the Community Church of New York.
So obviously we have somebody of authority here to speak to us. And I love his topic, giving people money they can't repay, but asking them to repay just doesn't work too well. I think I'll let you take it from here, Bruce.
Okay, well, you're going to start me off right out the gate here.
Well, I could have introduced myself, actually. I'm Terry Lohman. I'm co-chair for UU's for a Just Economic Community. Now, thank you, Bruce.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts with you on what a global just economy could look like. I should begin by saying that I'm not an expert in this field. People like Dr. Franz Verhagen have done some very profound thinking and writing on this topic. Franz is a member of the Community Church of New York, where I'm director of international engagement. I have lived and worked and traveled for most of my life overseas in Europe, Africa, South Asia, East Asia, and Central America. Here are the areas that I think I have something to offer: loans to developing countries and servicing national debt, unfair trade practices and loss and damage, paying fair prices for services, commodities, and the use of land, air, and water. In the early 1980s, while I was working in Somalia at the Somali Institute of International Development Administration and Management, I met officials from the World Bank who expressed concerns about irresponsible lending to developing nations, placing those nations in debt they could not pay. We should remember that these loans are often made to dictators who wish to build a palace or otherwise aggrandize their living conditions and that of their family and friends. The dictator may eventually be deposed, but the nation and its people remain stuck with paying the debt, which can be huge and impossible to pay off. In 2001, I attended the National Assembly of the Gambia, and I heard a speech of the Minister of Economy of the Gambia. The minister told the legislative body that 60% of the national budget was dedicated to servicing the debt. That means that 60% of the national budget goes to just paying the interest on the debt without reducing the debt level at all. That leaves 40% of the national budget for education, healthcare, administrative costs, defense, and etc. At the time, the military dictator Yahya Jammeh ruled the country with an iron fist. He killed and tortured both his friends and enemies. I used to joke, it's more dangerous to be a friend of Yahya Jammeh than an enemy. He's now left the country, but the debt remains with the country. I've been told by experts that this level of debt servicing is not the worst by any means. Many countries have debt servicing levels above 60% of the national budget. China has established what it calls the Belt and Road Initiative, which I initially endorsed because it was advertised as a way for China to build infrastructure around the world to lift poor nations out of poverty, as China has been able to lift millions of its citizens out of poverty. However, the global development projects that China is building around the world come with many strings attached. And most importantly, they are not free. The cost of the infrastructure projects is organized as loans, which the receiving nations must pay, and which they cannot pay, leaving them in terrible shape. The infrastructure usually benefits Chinese interests and does not greatly enhance the GDP of the recipient nation, which means the added infrastructure does nothing or little to help the debtor nation pay off the debt. So how do we rectify this situation? First of all, who's to blame? The loan is contracted by the lender and the government that's borrowing the money. However, the people are stuck with the bill are not the lending entity nor the government that's borrowing the money. The people stuck with the bill are the citizen taxpayers who nearly in every case have no say about the loan and who are stuck with the consequences of that loan. The system needs to have more equity where the lender and the borrowing government and the citizens who suffer the consequences of the loan share the pain and responsibility of the loan. That means if a loan can't be paid off, the lender must take a hit for the lending money to a country that does not have the capacity to pay off the loan. In other words, if you lend money to a country that doesn't have the capacity to pay off the loan, then the lender should bear some of the responsibility for that loss of money. That indicates the need for massive loan forgiveness. Governments shouldn't be allowed to borrow money without the consent of the governed. There needs to be a way to hold governments accountable for lending money that can't be repaid and holding the individual government officials accountable for borrowing money they don't have the capacity to repay or that their nation can't repay. Systems need to be devised to hold accountable both the lender and the borrower to protect the citizen taxpayers who ultimately need to pay the bill. The next issue I want to address is trade. I worked in the Department of State Bureau of International Organizations. As part of my work, I helped organize our delegations to the World Trade Organization. The U.S. delegation to the World Trade Organization is massive. There are economists, diplomats, support staff, researchers, and an entire army of negotiators to ensure that the United States trading interests are protected. Having worked in West Africa, I'm aware of West African trading concerns. The West African nation of Mali depends almost exclusively on the sale of its cotton crop. At the same World Trade Conference where the U.S. sent its army of economists, trade negotiations, and support staff, the government of Mali sent one lone delegate to represent Mali's critical need to get fair global trade. However, North America and the European Union and opulent Asian nations are able to leverage their power and wealth to benefit their nations at the expense of poorer nations. We need a WTO that is as fair to the United States trading requirements as it is to the trading requirements of a country like Mali. I'm going to talk about colonial legacies. I was the deputy chief of mission at the American Embassy in the Gambia. The British recorded, when they were overlords of the country, oral histories from many sources. This is documented in a book by Donald R. Wright entitled The World in a Very Small Place in Africa, A History of Globalization in Niamey and the Gambia. You'll see my review of that book on Amazon.com. My review states in part, quote, what Donald Wright also shows was that the African society and culture was well developed and self-sustaining. Africa was not the backward and helpless place we like to think it was. What distressed me most was that most African Americans share the common perception that Africa was a backward continent, when that is far from the truth. It is my wish that every American, especially every African American, read this book. The nation of Niue, which is now part of the Gambia and Senegal, was proud and completely self-sufficient, mostly through its own agriculture. Its trading relations served only to provide luxuries that people desired, not what they required, because what they required was cared for by their own agriculture. They didn't require things from overseas. They met their own needs internally. With European expansion, Niue became dependent on European traders for staple food supplies while supplying peanuts to European buyers with prices set in Europe, and I do mean peanuts. The global model of trade is what we now have. The new European trading model differed greatly from the previously used Islamic African Asian trading model, which is with its ban on interests, which left trading partners on a far more equal footing. I note that if you study Islam, Islam bans interest payments. And so the trading relationships in Africa and in the Islamic world were able to operate without the burden of interest payments. And so what we were just talking about is this 60% payment of the Gambia just for interest. And if you were in an Islamic system, there could be no interest charged. So it was a fairer system that prevailed in the Gambia before the Christian Westerners came. Niue, which is this small state within the Gambia, Senegal, moved from being the center of its own universe to become a forgotten place on the distant margins of a universe that has been constructed to serve the interests of the wealth of Europe, North America, Japan, and other big players. Donald Wright lays out the facts without emotion, but the reader cannot help but be emotional. Wright's description of the slave trade in a case is a case in point. Wright does not go down the path to describe in detail the horrors of the slave trade. Rather, he outlines the need for regional African powers to have horses to dominate their neighbors. He went on to describe how horses could not be bred in tropical Africa, so they were traded for slaves at 15 slaves per horse. Wright's account of this terrible enterprise, which held human life so cheaply, struck me with greater force than the more detailed descriptions of the personal sufferings in this horrible trade in people. The book describes how the Gambians were self-sufficient growing sorghum. The British got them to grow peanuts, or groundnuts as the British prefer to call them. The Gambians sell the peanuts and use the proceeds to buy imported rice, which is now the staple diet of the country. However, with the United States not allowing Gambian peanuts into the United States to protect the peanut farmers in the state of Georgia, the Gambians find it year by year their peanuts sell for less and less, and the rice costs more and more. They can't set the price of their own peanuts. Those prices are set by and large by powerful trading countries. On top of all that, climate change has resulted in the river Gambia having less and less water, which the Atlantic Ocean water migrating further and further up the river Gambia, increasing the salt content, makes the river water less and less able to support agriculture and human life. In matters of loans and trade, the big, rich, powerful countries have an unfair advantage over poor nations, leading to greater and greater distortions in income distribution and quality of life. We need to make the system fairer and more equitable in both international finance and trade. What are the consequences of continuing the present system? More global migration, more devastating poverty, more conflict and wars. Here's one more inequality. We spend $17.7 billion on border security. What if we took a fraction of this money and used the money to solve political, law enforcement, and economic problems in Haiti and Central America and elsewhere? This reallocation of funds would produce far better results than what we face now. When I was the Regional Refugee Coordinator for West Africa, I received a visit from Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner and his assistant to visit refugee camps in West Africa. He is a very conservative former member of Congress. He was chair of the House Judiciary Committee, and he was from Wisconsin. I took him to refugee camps with 30 or 40,000 West African refugees. He was appalled, and he asked, how could we keep these peoples from coming to America? I said, simple, take care of them where they are. Make sure they have decent housing, education for their children, income generating projects so that they can earn money, healthcare, and a safe environment. This is true everywhere in the world. How do we solve the Israel-Palestinian problem? Make sure the Palestinian people have decent housing, education for their children, income generating projects so that they can earn money, healthcare, and a safe environment in which they can live with dignity. We spend vast amounts of money to ensure we have the advantage of overwhelming force and domination. Yet the immigrants keep coming, and the global problems continue to threaten global stability. We are spending our vast wealth in the wrong thing. For the small fraction of the costs we spend on U.S. military assistance to Israel, we could end poverty in Africa. Please understand, we have the funds to both protect Israel and eliminate poverty in Africa and elsewhere. We need a fair system that provides all people with the safe and dignified life we expect for ourselves. I know there is more to this important topic to discuss, but this is pretty much the best insights this non-expert can provide at the moment. I look forward to learning from you and what I may have missed in this topic or failed to notice. So I look forward to hearing from you. I'm open to any questions or comments you have.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Bruce. Amazing. Almost everybody stayed with us to the end. So I'm going to stop the recording, and I hope everyone has a good evening.